Imagine you're a prehistoric human wandering through a humid forest 10,000 years ago. Your stomach is growling with the kind of intensity that makes a handful of grubs look like a five-star meal, and you stumble across a pile of mushy, overripe fruit at the base of a tree. It smells weird, sharp, sweet, and slightly like a chemistry experiment gone wrong. But you're too hungry to be picky, so you dig in, and 20 minutes later the world feels suspiciously more manageable and your fellow cave dwellers seem way more interesting than they did this morning. You've just become the first person in history to experience a buzz, and while you don't have a word for it yet, you've just stumbled onto a biological hack that will eventually build civilizations, fund empires, and result in some of the most questionable decisions in the history of our species. We tend to think of alcohol as a modern luxury, something we invented once we had enough spare time to stop worrying about being eaten by leopards. But the reality is that we were pre-gaming the agricultural revolution by millions of years. This wasn't a choice we made, it was a survival strategy that was hard-coded into our DNA long before we even looked like humans. Let's start with the Drunken Monkey Hypothesis. Somewhere around 10 million years ago, our ancestors were living in the trees, but the climate was changing, the forests were thinning, and the competition for fresh fruit was becoming a literal matter of life and death. If you were a primate who could only eat perfectly ripe fruit, you were in trouble, because the stuff on the branches was being snatched up by everyone else. But the fruit on the ground, the mushy, fermenting, slightly off stuff, that was an untapped goldmine of calories. The problem was that fermenting fruit contains ethanol, which is essentially a low-grade poison. For most animals, eating a pile of fermented figs would result in a massive loss of coordination, making them an easy, pre-marinated snack for the nearest predator. But humans, and our closest cousins, developed a specific mutation in a gene called ADH4. This mutation made us 40 times more efficient at breaking down ethanol than any other primate. We didn't just learn to like alcohol, we evolved to treat it as a high-density fuel source that allowed us to eat the trash fruit that would have killed our competitors. But here's the thing nobody really thinks about. Alcohol didn't just give us calories, it gave us a GPS for food. In a dense prehistoric jungle, how do you find a fruit tree from a mile away? You follow your nose. Fermenting fruit broadcasts a massive chemical signal, the smell of ethanol, that cuts through the humidity like a beacon. To an ancient human, the smell of a brewery wasn't a signal to party, it was a signal that dinner was served. Now, let's fast forward a few million years to the moment things got social. For most of our history, we were small, nomadic groups where trust was the only thing keeping you from getting a spear in the back. Living in a group is hard. It's full of social anxiety, hierarchy, and the constant stress of not offending the person who holds the sharpest rock. Then came the lucky ferment. Imagine a tribe of hunter-gatherers who had spent the day gathering wild honey or berries, and they left them in a hollowed-out log or a stone basin. Maybe it rained, the berries got crushed, and wild yeast, which is literally everywhere, floating in the air and crawling on every piece of fruit, went to work. A few days later, the tribe finds a pool of weird, fizzy liquid. They drink it because water is scarce and this stuff tastes interesting, and suddenly, the sentinel function of the brain, the part that's always looking for threats and judging your neighbors, takes a back seat. Alcohol is the world's oldest social lubricant. It suppresses the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for impulse control and social inhibition. In a high-stakes survival environment, that sounds like a disaster, but for a species that depends entirely on cooperation, it was a miracle. It allowed groups to bond, to share stories, and to lower their guard long enough to turn strangers into allies. This brings us to a theory that completely flips our understanding of history on its head, the beer before bread hypothesis. For decades, the standard story was that humans invented farming to grow grain for bread, and then eventually, someone noticed their dough got bubbly and they accidentally made beer. But archaeologists looking at sites like Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey, a massive stone temple built 11,000 years ago, found something strange. There's evidence of massive feasts and giant stone vats that could hold up to 40 gallons of liquid, but there's almost no evidence of permanent housing or large-scale bread ovens. It looks like we didn't settle down because we wanted sandwiches. We settled down because we wanted to throw a party. To make enough alcohol for a massive social gathering, you need a lot of grain. You can't just rely on what you find in the woods. You have to stay in one place, protect the field, and wait for the harvest. Brewing required a level of logistics and long-term planning that bread simply didn't. It's entirely possible that the desire for a consistent supply of fermented drinks is the actual reason we stopped being nomads and started being civilized. And let's talk about the safety factor, because this is where ancient science gets genuinely impressive. Before we understood germ theory, before we knew that the river water was full of things that wanted to turn your insides into outsides, we knew that fermented liquids were safer. The process of fermentation produces ethanol and increases acidity, both of which are remarkably good at killing off common waterborne pathogens like cholera and dysentery. Ancient people weren't drinking beer because they wanted to be drunk all day. They were drinking small beer, a low-alcohol, nutrient-rich porridge, because it was the only way to stay hydrated without dying of a stomach infection. They didn't understand the chemistry, but they practiced the empiricism. They noticed that the people drinking the fizzy water lived longer than the people drinking the river water, and they passed that knowledge down through stories and rituals until it became a cultural pillar. But there's a darker side to this biological default. Because we evolved to seek out ethanol as a rare, high-calorie survival resource, our brains never developed a stop button for it. In the Stone Age, you might find a fermented windfall once every few months, and you'd gorge yourself because those calories were precious. But in a world where you can walk into a store and buy a gallon of the stuff for the price of a lunch, that prehistoric scarcity mindset becomes a neurological trap. Our modern struggle with addiction is essentially the sound of an ancient survival program running on modern hardware. Your brain thinks it's finding a miracle fuel that will help you survive the winter, while your body is trying to process a level of concentrated toxin that your ancestors couldn't have imagined in their wildest dreams. We are the descendants of the primates who were the best at processing alcohol, which means we are also the ones most susceptible to its pull. The discovery of alcohol wasn't just a lucky accident. It was a fundamental shift in how humans interacted with the world and each other. It turned a poison into a calorie source, a social barrier into a bonding ritual, and a nomadic tribe into a settled society. It's the reason we have pottery, to store the liquid, the reason we have writing, to keep track of the rations, and potentially the reason we have the massive, complex social structures we inhabit today. We are a species that literally hacked nature to turn decay into fuel and anxiety into connection. We are the drunken monkeys who figured out how to use the chemistry of the forest to survive the crushing weight of being a person. It's a messy, complicated, and often beautiful legacy that has been bubbling away in the background of our history since the very beginning. The next time you're raising a glass with friends, just remember, you aren't just participating in a modern social ritual, you're engaging in a 10-million-year-old biological tradition. You are celebrating the fact that your ancestors were the ones who could eat the rotten fruit and keep walking while everyone else stayed in the trees. We didn't just discover alcohol, we used it to bridge the gap between being an animal and being a human, for better or for worse. If you want to dive deeper into the hidden biological bugs that shaped human history, hit the subscribe button and let me know in the comments which accidental discovery we should look at next.